a question, will this be recorded? Yes, this will be recorded. We're going to do it. So if you have to leave early, don't worry about it. So you might be riveted to the,
That's right.
Engaging.
You won't want to leave early. It'll be
interesting. It's so good.
You can also always watch the Undoing season finale or the last episode of Queen's Gambit. You can't hear the last minute that you're going to want to hear on test prep.
Nope. They found a way to make chess sexy again.
Right.
Chess set sales are up 130%. That's amazing.
Okay, well, first off, welcome everyone. Wednesday, December 2nd is a crazy time to talk about test prep, but honestly, if you're a parent of a student in the class of 2022, there is only unending craziness in terms of trying to figure out what is the deal with admissions testing. And Lisa and I have been lucky enough to know Jed, in Lisa's case, for probably longer than 10 years. And we instantly thought there's no better person that we know of to share guidance, wisdom, insight. And there's no one that we respect more in terms of his care and belief about the student, not just the score, not just the admissions, but the student. He is profoundly committed to the health of the student and to the sanity of the student in a time that is so challenging. So we want to welcome you this evening. We've all been on countless of these webinars, but just as a reminder, yes, we'll be recording it and we'll share it with everyone as a follow-up. If you have questions, feel free to share them in the Q&A box. We'll monitor it, but Jed has a ton of content, so we may not get to all of them. We will keep a transcript of the Q&A bot, and if there are questions that we can follow up on, we'll definitely follow up on those. But I'm gonna pass it over to Jed and thank him ever so much for taking time away from his gorgeous young daughter to share with us his insight, counsels, and points of view on test prep. Jed, welcome.
Thank you, Bob. Great to be here, man. Yeah, so tonight we'll talk testing. And as mentioned, I do have a lot of content. I cover a lot of slides pretty quickly, but we're going to share the deck with you guys. So we'll email Bob a PDF of the deck. You can peruse things at your leisure if there are numbers or stats or whatnot. And I tend to just do a broad overview. There's a lot to cover. I could talk for 3 hours, but I won't. But I'll kind of give you a surface level of what's happening, what matters in the world, and especially, this year especially, in terms of how to think about this if you're a junior parent, what's coming in the next year, what do we know, what do we think might happen, and so forth. So let's jump in. And again, if you have questions, the Q&A, but we'll probably answer many of them as I deliver the deck. All right, let me dive in. Okay, so topics today: the testing, the essays, test optional, the SAT subject test, all these good things. And it's important to know is historically testing is up there with grades. It goes grades is first, rigor is second, testing is third. That's the way it's been for many years. Then beyond that, and those are all measurable metrics. They're easy to compare. They're very efficient metrics. Then you go down to essays, demonstrated interest, counselor recs, teacher recs, activities, and so forth. But typically, it's at the very top. It's mostly, it's more numbers because colleges are really worried. Can kids make it in our college? Are we going to give an offer if a student won't thrive here? And the best predictors that we know of, grades are the best predictor. And then, academic rigor is very important, and testing has been third historically for many, many years. So a brief overview, the two assessments, those of you new to the process. SAT is a little bit heavier in reading, higher level reading by about 2 years. It's an 11th grade level of reading versus a 9th grade for the ACT. That's one key difference, which means more advanced vocabulary, more complex and longer sentence structures, and so forth. The ACT, they balance it out. They are more rigorous when it comes to math and STEM. So they have more advanced math content than you'll ever see on the SAT. And they have a standalone 40-question science section, which is a more robust measure of your science knowledge than what you have on the SAT. So that's a very basic broad level difference. The content overlaps 80%. So that means if you're prepping for one, you're prepping for the other. And we have kids cross over back and forth. And this realignment really happened in 2016 with the advent of the new SAT. that really brought them so close together. And since then, they're not interchangeable. There's still some differences in terms of speed, in terms of difficulty of the reading and the math. But honestly, there's a lot of common aspects. So structurally, big blocks, big reading, big writing or English, big math. And again, science has a standalone, science exists on the ACT. There is science content peppered around the SAT. There'll be a science reading passage. There'll be some science in the writing passage. There'll be some science and math questions, but there is no standalone section. Then you have a break. They both now have these short experimental sections to help them with getting information and data on items for future tests. And then finally, they have these things at the end, the optional essays, which it seems are on their way out. Those things, there's not much traction or movement. Everyone's dropping the essay as we get further and further along. A key difference to know about the ACT is more about speed. It's a speedier test. The SAT, when it was redesigned, they cut out like 30, 40 questions, maintain the same time. So now you have about 40% more time per question on the SAT. That's a key difference for kids who may have speed issues, timing issues. Whenever we're prepping kids for the ACT, we have a clock, we're doing timing drills, and that's really part and parcel of that assessment. It's more about a speed test than a power test, the parlance of academic testing. So mathematics, they do diverge some. I mentioned that the math is more advanced on the ACT, more advanced content. And the SAT, they did a massive realignment with the Common Core state standards. And it became more about applied math, about reading and math in context. Can I read a passage and then back out the math and use it? So it's in a more applied math, where the ACT math still exists more in isolation. There are word problems, but not as many, not as wordy as on the SAT. The amount of algebra, it's bigger. It's the lion's share of content on the SAT, about 2/3 of the content. Geometry, they scaled it way back. It used to be about 1/4 of the test. Now it's only about 3 questions per test are geometry based, because they figured most kids going to college won't be needing geometry once they're in college. So they really made it more about algebra and then stats and a little bit of trig and so forth. There's always about 4 trig questions on every ACT versus 0, 1, or 2 on every SAT. So some similarities, some differences, more heavy reading, more heavy algebra for the SAT. ACT is more varied. And they also go into more challenging material. They're going to go into matrices, matrix multiplication, more knowledge. They expect you to know how to work with an ellipse formula, a parabola, a circle. They're going to ask about domains and ranges, about asymptotes and lines of fit. And so there's simply harder math on the ACT. That's part of their design. So the question is always, which one do I go with first? And ultimately, colleges don't care which one you take. It's all about the percentile you achieve and where are you better. And so in a perfect world, we have kids doing practice tests in both, getting a dual baseline before they begin preparation, and then going with their stronger test. You can definitely use the PSAT as a proxy for the SAT. They're almost identical in content. Just the scoring, you cap out at 1520 for the PSAT, but then you have an extra 80 points available to you on the SAT when they go to higher math and trig and so forth, and higher level reading and more science reading. So, but you want to take both at the beginning and find out what's the higher percentile. And if they're, if you're in the range of indifference, which is about a 60-point scale on the SAT, so that's if I get a 1200 on the SAT and I get a 25 or a 27 on the ACT, I'm in the range of indifference. I'm in the margin of error on both tests. Therefore, I defer to which one felt more natural, more comfortable. And then, but if you're beyond that 60-point range, if I get a 26 on the ACT, but a 1290 SAT, well, I'm going to put all my eggs in the basket of the SAT. I'm better there. And on any given day, I shouldn't ever do worse than I would do on the ACT without preparation. So go with your stronger test. That really is the rule. And so I just explained this slide essentially. Okay. Now, when it comes to scheduling, ideally, I've done plenty of research on this over 20 years, and students tend to do very well when they're prepping in earnest and doing review and mastery and feedback through their 3rd official SAT or ACT. So that's a real benefit. There's something, it's called testing effects. So you get more familiar, more confident, and you just, gain some test wiseness. So typically students peak on their 3rd test, not always, but mostly. And some kids, though, they prep, they go in there and take it once and they're finished. That's delightful. It's amazing. And we love that. But often we see kids still showing gains. They show a nice gain on many sections through their 2nd test, and a more of a sectional gain, a marginal gain on the third test. But often that peak score is test number 3. Okay, timelines. That was a question that was posed to Bob and Lisa earlier. And what's going on for this year? And part of it, understanding what's coming. If you're currently a junior, some of you have struggled to get access to them for options for testing. And things are getting better. In November, only 30% of kids who were signed up for the SAT couldn't take it. And that was way down from earlier in the year. So things are moving in the right direction. And, it really does seem like, there's a lot of excitement around all the good news with Moderna and with Pfizer and with, things are coming, things are shifting. And more schools are going to be opening. Although the converse is we may be hitting another wave because of the holidays. And so there's a balance point of access. I guess that affects schools. If schools aren't open, then schools can't host the SAT or the ACT. So it has to do with, are we entering, with more lockdowns? Will it be more liberal? My sense is the springtime and then the summertime, it's going to get a lot easier. And then, by the summer, things should be essentially, hopefully back to normal, back to where things were before the pandemic. And that's going to be a tremendous deal because we've had kids struggling tremendously to get testing. Though in certain markets, it's been easier. We work with kids in Texas, we have kids in Atlanta, Seattle. Like our kids in Seattle, our kids in San Diego and LA, they've been hit really, really hard. Certain markets have just been closed out. Other markets have been relatively easy. So it really varies on where you live. But ultimately, the story is going forward, it's going to be a lot easier. So if I'm a junior and I'm looking ahead of, looking at my options, they teased initially that there might be a January SAT, though we've seen nothing since then. That was a tease back in August. So because we're a month out, it's probably not going to be happening unless they could do a last minute thing. So most likely, the SATs after December, we're going to have an option in March, and then back to normal May, June. They did have an August and September test this year. We doubt that'll happen again once things normalize. They were trying to manage the bottleneck because they canceled half of March, all of May, all of June. So they added that September test trying to make up for that. But things should, the senior bottleneck is about to be done, which means there shouldn't be this crush of pent-up demand going forward. So then the question is, do I sit for March from a junior? Ultimately, you want to have multiple signups. So if you're going the route of the SAT, I contemplate doing a March, May, June, or I consider, doing May, June, August. You want to get things in before early deadlines. There's a chance they might delay things. This year, we've seen some deadlines pushed because of the pandemic, but things may get back to normal once school is back in session and tests are coming in on normal timelines. So I don't expect much deviation from their normal timeline after we get through this year. I could be wrong, of course, but I would expect them to go back to what was before. Now, the ACT there'll be a test coming up in February, which again, depending on the holidays and depending on what happens, that one may be a little spottier. But then April should be a lot better, and then June, and then July, and September. So again, you want to find your 3 if you're a junior. And if you are a sophomore, then when this school year ends and you enter the pre-junior summer, then it's open season for you as well to begin thinking about testing, doing some work on that. And again, things should be a lot better this summer. They've not been gating it. So if you're a junior, you don't have priority over sophomores or over freshmen even. So they really have it's kind of a free-for-all once you're in the queue. For kids who were canceled, had priority, but since then there's been no prioritization, no gating by class year and so forth. So the name of the game is find 3 that work, and it's totally fine to do, let's say, an April ACT, they come back and do July and September, or it's some kids, they save them all for the summer, they'll do a June, July, September for the ACT, totally fine. And we do believe that we're going to have far fewer disruptions after spring, especially if vaccines are widespread in April, May, and June, and we take the CDC at their word, and things are going to be really very different starting late spring. There's been some questions of, are tests easier or harder on a given test date? Like, is October always harder? Is January always easier? Is May? And the answer is no. In a given year, there'll be some variability. And so you're going to have a really hard math section, let's say in this March, but then next March, it's going to be very, very easy. And so everyone freaks out about a really hard section, but there's no pattern that's consistent year over year over year. So there is variability across a calendar year, but there's not a consistent pattern of what's easier or hard. So ignore people who tell you always avoid November. There's no factual basis in that. Same thing for the ACT, that they tend to solve for that, although different tests have different curves. We did some research trying to figure out, was there a maturation effect as I become a senior versus as a junior? Do my scores increase on the SAT? A very obvious, smart question, and the answer is no. The answer is there is a very clear testing effect, that if I take the test 3 times, my third test will be better. But kids starting earlier, their third test could be in March, and they're going to have their peak on the third test. For other kids, they wait for the third test in October, but there seems to be no real growth over the summer, because these tests really are not like senior-based tests. Most of the math is 10th grade math. Most of the the grammar. Most kids aren't doing grammar when they're in 10th grade. Grammar is mostly like a middle school, 9th grade. So most people, whatever grammar errors they have, are still with them when they go from 10th to 11th grade, unless you have a teacher who's doing explicit grammar instruction. But by the time you're in AP English, you rarely have someone doing a grammar 2 months. It's really on to other things. So most people aren't really becoming better grammarians unless you have teachers really focusing on that. And so our experience is it's testing effects, not maturation effects. Things that work, if you want to score good on these tests, practice testing is very important. I did some research that kids were getting about 12 points per practice test on their final. So that is helpful, learning mastery, learning how to manage the timing and the guessing and so forth. When you spread things out, you do better than when you cram. So it's spending 8-10 weeks of prep is a lot better and more efficient than the same number of hours over 2 weeks. You need time to practice, time to learn and forget and relearn. Kids who start earlier than start later as a junior tend to do better. So that's one thing in terms of if you have the ability to spread things out. And that was mostly mediated by there was more time on task, there was more practice effects and so forth. Kids who put in more time tend to do better. Putting in 40 hours of preparation, you tend to do better than putting in 5 hours. And that makes some sense. There is a point of diminishing returns. But typically kids who spend more time, same thing on an AP exam. The more time you put in, you tend to have higher scores typically. And then finishing strong, having some momentum to the end, the final test is very helpful. And kids who have a goal, that has a positive effect on follow through, on completion, and on motivation levels. So having a number you're going for is helpful. Having a school you're aspiring for, that can be beneficial. All right, one quick thing, if you were worried about a test score for the ACT and you had a bad test score, all you have to do is send a letter to the ACT and it's permanently expunged. It's off your record forever. And that's for the few schools, there are like 20 competitive schools who want all your testing. Most everyone in the country will do score choice, but there are still a few schools who have you sign a pledge saying you want everything. And if you write a letter here, if you have a bad score on ACT, it's gone forever. It didn't happen. All right, now we're going to do a review of what's up with the ACT, then what's up with the SAT. ACT, they have a new CEO. She postponed something very important, sectional testing, that we're going to have starting in 2021. We don't know when, the ability to go in there and just take one section of a test. That's amazing once you have one full one under your belt. So if I took one full test, I can go in there and just take math or just take science. That'll be incredible for preparation. But that was supposed to happen in September of this year. That got pushed. So I'm assuming it'll happen in April or the summer, but we don't know. They've made nothing firm, but I doubt they're going to open up with it in February. But it is coming. The name of the game is get through the bottleneck now, get past COVID, and then let's add this in. They have to do some training on this and so forth, train proctors and all that jazz. Registration has varied so much by where you live. Some people have had to travel distances. It was crazy back in the springtime. When we had the first June ACT and kids were traveling all over the place. But things have been better. It's been getting better as seniors get through the bottleneck. We do know that one thing that's changed for this year, we have SuperScore reporting, which is pretty groovy, where you log into a MyST account and it'll have automatically generated your SuperScore. And so it'll pull from the April 19th one, that was a state-based test that was given in your school. And then your science was from that April 19th test. But then your national test date in September, that goes on there. And then your December reading, that goes on there too. And so instantly you generate the SuperScore and I press send and off it goes to colleges to SuperScore. You save a few bucks. It's very simple. We like that. There was going to be, with sectional retesting, that was all going to be computer-based. And so we were going to have in September computer-based testing. That again is being pushed to next year. And again, we don't have firm dates. Initially, they said that you're going to be able to log in and enter your zip code, and they're going to show you where they're going to offer computer-based testing. Right now, we haven't heard of this on the site yet. So again, they're just dealing with bottlenecks and supply and demand issues right now. But it's coming. Computer-based testing is coming, not required but optional for on Saturdays for national test dates, as well as the sectional testing, which will be a game changer for a lot of kids. You just go in there and prep everything for one section, and then they're done with it for the day. It's really cool. Again, we don't know about the CPT offerings. It's coming. College Board, what are they up to? Well, here it's showing an example of some of the difficulties of meeting supply and demand. So in some places, November, almost all the kids were taken in Seattle. They're just hosed. I mean, we have kids there who can't find a test for 200 miles. California, some of them similar. LA, and the whole West Coast has been hit so hard. But Raleigh, December, wide open. In Baltimore and Towson, Maryland, wide open. Miami. So December, again, we've worked through a lot of the senior bottleneck. Dallas, Fort Worth, things were pretty tough in November, but then starting in December, a lot more options. And that'll continue, for the March test going forward. So it seems like a lot of places have worked through the big bottlenecks, thankfully. And then there's another example. I think we've covered all the ones from Texas. Austin, Round Rock, again, a lot better for the December SAT. So we know the PSAT will be offered for the first time in January. For many schools, it couldn't do it in October for the National Merit Test. Not a big deal for most people, but for the small number of kids going for National Merit, some high schools will offer this in January as a qualifying test. We know it's all masked up. There were questions about the writing portion, the essay at the end, and honestly, it's barely alive at this point. California dropped the essay when they had their meeting of their Board of Regents back in May, and California was propping this thing up because they had 220,000 kids applying. But without them, it's really, there's not much left. These schools in a non-COVID year used to require it. Rhode Island, SoCA, but only 3,000 kids in the country are applying to these schools. So that's 1 out of 100. This is not a big deal for, Minnesota Morris, Mary Hardin Baylor. These are not big schools, the grand scheme, except for, West Point. But then you have those schools recommended, but not required. And then I see we have, like Duke and Amherst, Michigan State, and there's about Texas State, about 250,000 kids are applying to these schools here, a little more than that. But it's optional and it's recommended, but not required. So if you don't have it, and ultimately these things were being used more to measure how much help you got. If you got too much help on your essays, it was a forced writing sample. It was really not being used to keep you out if your score was too low. But if they had any question about who wrote your Common App question, they'd look at this and just compare. That was really the main purpose of the essays. Not if I only got a 7 or 8, I'm not going to let you in as a freshman. Most kids don't need the essay, and I wouldn't be surprised if within a year or two the essay is just gone. The numbers are dropping, and after the California decision and after what's happening, I imagine like it was like for last year, the number of kids taking the essay had fallen under half, but this year it could be like a quarter of kids, and eventually, why even have it if no one's using it anymore? Accommodations, those have been affected. Some of you out there have had a hard time getting accommodations, especially if you needed more than time and a half, or some kids need a double time or multi-day or a quiet room or a reader. And those accommodations are school-based, and those have been harder with schools being virtual or closed or just unable to allocate resources to this. And that was a reason why University of California, they aren't even allowed to use the SAT because somebody sued in federal court and said it was a violation of the ADA, of their rights. They couldn't get access to their accommodations, therefore no one can use testing and for UC for this calendar year. We have a great guide. It's about a 47-page guide to accommodations. You go to this website and you download it. It's free. It's very helpful. All the steps, all the processes, trying to help kids understand how do I navigate this, working with my school counselor, working with the disabilities coordinator for my high school and so forth, testing coordinators. AP exams, most likely they're going to be in the normal form this year. We're assuming that last year we had so many hundreds of colleges gave full credit for the AP scores that were administered over the 1 hour blocks. I'm sorry, they were 45 minutes. They were short, sweet, open book. This year, don't expect that. I expect them to be back to normal. And it was a one-time thing. And colleges are saying it's great, we'll take it. Though a few schools like Princeton said, well, you got a 5 on chemistry, but are you really ready for chemistry 201? And so we don't, things that are more sequential, like science and languages, they're actually having their own assessments that they created just to make sure they didn't put kids in harm's way and then put them in really, really hard tests. If that 5 was open book over half an hour, really what, in covering content through March, are you really ready for the next level if you're doing those classes? So trust but verify, that was their policy. Now, when it comes to these things, the SAT test for subjects, they're getting hit pretty hard. Schools have been dropping them. Last year in February, pre-pandemic, we had 3 of the big STEM schools. We had MIT drop them, Caltech drop them, Harvard might drop them, and they'd require them forever. And then after that, we've had more schools dropping them. And so now these are really optional, but if you're a STEM kid applying to an engineering program or maybe a finance program or pre-med, it's a way to show off your chops. Getting 780 on chemistry or physics, their bio is still pretty impressive. And this year, though, these are really optional because kids have been struggling to get access to the SAT proper. And so on a given day, you can take either the SAT or 1, 2, or 3 of these tests for subjects. There are 20 of them. And most kids haven't been able to take it because most kids take these in May or June to correspond with their AP exams. But obviously this year, those tests didn't happen. So most kids who would have taken the AP bio and then they would have taken their SAT bio couldn't take it because there was nothing offered until August. And then even then, half of the kids couldn't get access. So most kids haven't taken these tests this year. Again, the big ones are STEM, Math 2 is pre-calculus. And so engineers, and they love Math 2, chemistry, physics, bio. The languages are really much less important. And I wouldn't be surprised, again, I'm waiting for the shoe to drop here. When you have 400 kids taking Hebrew and German and Italian, they're not going to bother making new tests. It's not cost effective for them for only a few hundred kids. So they're just recycling the same test again and again and again, which creates security issues. And there's no innovation, and it's still tied to pre-com and core stuff. But the STEM ones are valuable, and those are most of the kids taking those. Math 2, chemistry, physics, and so forth. And they're a small and shrinking part of the portfolio. APs are just crushing it, but the SAT subjects are in decline. And this year, that number could be like 200,000. It's going to be a massive drop this year. So those schools who require them are 0, but the schools who now recommend them, and it's funny, I've been giving this talk for over 10 years, but there used to be about 60 schools on this list, and now it's down to 9. Those who recommend, encourage, are welcome. If UC, Webb, Harvard, Georgetown, Penn, Lehigh, Davidson, Dartmouth. This year, Yale is not, but normally they do recommend it. But then you have schools who will consider it, like Rice. If I have a 780 on physics, Rice will look at that. If I have a 720 on math, that becomes part of the conversation. So it's not required. Same thing as AP scores aren't required. But if you have 5 on an AP, I want Rice to know about it. So if I get a 770 on chemistry, it shows a mastery of a certain level of content. So Tufts, Pomona, Emory, Delaware, Hopkins, Columbia, good schools. So they will look at your scores. They're optional, but they're part of the conversation. Though all the schools who used to recommend them strongly are now, these are really optional because they understand kids haven't been able to test at all. Some places. Harvard, like, no penalties. Yale said these are really optional. And Princeton's like, you'll be no problem if you don't have these. And they mean that. That's true. But if you have them, it's part of the conversation. But the same, you don't have to have them to be part of the conversation. Test optional. There's been a massive wave, over 550 schools have gone optional for this year. And I think the majority will stay optional for next year. So many are waiting for the spring to announce. But if we're still doing the pandemic dance, most likely they'll be announcing stay the course until next year. And there have been some announcements in that vein. So 550 plus schools went optional, and most great schools all over the country. And those who haven't, like Florida, held the line. Florida didn't go optional, and their applications are down dramatically. We're talking, I've seen some number like 50%. So schools who didn't make this optional are losing plenty of out-of-state kids and international applicants and so forth. So international applicants also, we have students who work all over the world, and many of our kids have just gotten shut out, that there's nothing offered in their country. And so if those kids want to go to Florida, well, now they're like, well, we can't. And so schools, I don't, it's hard to defend making testing required when certain kids just can't. That seems to be a weird position in this year. So test optional is very rational in this year, honestly. But we know that, almost all the liberal arts schools in the country are optional. About 6 in 10 top research schools are optional. Nationally, so roughly 2/3 of the schools in the U.S. are optional. That's a big deal, very big deal. So this number is a couple weeks or maybe a month or so old, but it's a big number of schools. Last year it was over 1,000, but this year we added a lot more. Inside Higher Ed did a survey, and they said, you know what, only a small number of people who answered the survey still require testing. And the stat that got my attention was about 7 in 10 said they expect to keep their policies they've adopted after the pandemic. So it seems like the cat may be out of the bag. So again, for next year, I wouldn't be surprised if the majority, of schools who are optional this year stay optional. But even beyond that, even post-pandemic, after COVID's done, a lot of schools who are now optional will be optional. So as part of it, they're going to be able to see that they can recommend a class, but they can build a class. But still, optional and blind are universes apart. Test scores still matter very much in an optional world. And so we'll talk about that. So most colleges, if you have good tests, the same thing as, AP classes are optional. You don't have to do AP classes, but if you have them, it's part of the conversation. You don't have to be the editor of your yearbook. If you are, it's part of the conversation. It becomes something that's definitely a plus factor. So if I get a 34 on the ACT, that's part of the conversation. If I'm student body president, that's part of the conversation. You don't have to be that. There are other ways to get in, but it is definitely a pathway of showing strength academically with strong GPA, strong testing. That's a very classic established path. There are definitely alternative paths. And so we have some schools who are blind. 1-year blind experiments, Cal State, UC, Washington State, Reed, St. Xavier, Idaho, Caltech for 2 years, and then a few schools went permanent, but they're smaller schools. Loyola, Northern Illinois. The Catholic was never as selective as top schools, but they're trying to attract more applications, and they believe they don't need the test scores. But of the hundreds of schools who went optional, only a few went blind. It's important. So part of it is test blind and optional. When many schools out there allocate merit-based aid by GPA and testing, because a lot of kids have good grades. Grades have been going up for the past 30, 40 years, and there's a lot of grade compression, especially in more affluent zip codes and in private schools. And so kids look more the same in terms of GPA. That's been a challenge. So testing, they allocate money by grades and by testing. Here's Wabash is showing you a sample. As my GPA keeps going up, my testing keeps going up, they keep offering me more money. From a 3 to a 21 ACT, they offer me $17,000 a year. Then if I get up to a 3.8 and a 28 ACT, I get $30,000 off a year. And then if I get a 29 plus and a 3.9, I'm saving $32,000 a year. So these are merit-based scholarships. And Alabama is very famous. They've given it well over $100 million in the past decade. And what they do, again, it's a matrix. Given my 3.5 GPA, as my test scores go up, the merit-based aid goes up commensurately. So if I have a 27 on the ACT, they're offering me, $8,000 off a year. If I get 29, well, I just, saved another $28,000 over the 4 years. If I go to 30, I just save another $9,000 a year. So then if I get a 32, tuition goes from 30 grand a year down to $2,000 a year. That's profound. And that's how Alabama is able to yield kids who they, enrolling kids from Cornell, and they're going to Alabama because Alabama's free. And then they're going to go to Cornell for grad school. And so, and 4 in 10 kids in Alabama are from out of state, and they've used this merit-based aid to really transform their school, their class, their alumni base. So they merit-based aid is a big deal, and that's still tied to test scores. Test optional admissions, how will it affect application levels? Well, typically when you go optional, more kids apply, especially to selected schools. Schools are selective are getting a lot more applications this year. And because for a lot of kids who wanted to go to this big name school like a Rice or like a Cornell, their test scores, they're like, I don't have the scores for that school. I can't get to Rice. Then the test scores go away, and then everyone's like, well, why not apply? because now that was keeping me out. So a lot of kids are applying, especially name schools. Here's something from an example. Our good friend over at Georgia Tech, Rick Clark. We've had many talks or several talks with Rick over the years, and he said for the early admissions for Tech, they had a 25% increase in applications, which is baffling. On average, in the country, enrollment applications are down 8% all over the U.S., but at the flagship schools and the schools that are selective, they're up. So UT, they're going to be up. Rice, they're going to be up. Georgia Tech, all the Ivies up. 18% increase from Georgia in-state, 30% from kids out of state, and surprisingly, 56% increase in international applicants. That could be because of the transition in administrations, maybe they'll be more friendly to international kids, getting visas and so forth. But that was surprising to see those numbers. Admissions at the Ivies, we've heard Harvard's up 50%, which is insane. That's going to drive their admission rate down to like 2%. It's going to be it's so ridiculous. But anyhow, they can. And yeah, we did a talk with the head of admissions over at Cornell. He was saying they were up 40%. So the Ivies are just popping. So everyone's applying to the Ivies because why not? Test scores are optional. Let me apply. Who cares? And so it's going to make it that much harder in Cornell. They've clarified that typically if you don't have testing, what it means is we're going to increase scrutiny on everything else you submit, on your grades, on your rigor, on other essays, counselor recs. And that makes sense. Of course they should. If your algorithm is testing GPA, then you pull out a piece. Well, you have to allocate the focus on other pieces. So that's just logical. No surprise there. Typically in a normal year, going test optional for a school means about 10-15% of your people who apply to your school and are accepted are non-submitters. That's on a non-COVID year. Bill Hiss did a study. He has a big research out of Wake Forest that from his small sample of mostly liberal arts schools, a few national schools, about 1 in 4 kids who were accepted didn't have test scores. And then other schools here, I pull like Wake Forest, they've been optional for over 12 years. About 8 or 9 of every 10 kids who apply has a test score. Same with American, George Mason, about 8 in 10 kids. Worcester Poly, Brandeis, 9 in 10 kids who get in, who are accepted, have a test score. Smith, 80%. Again, Wesleyan. So these schools, these are kids who are accepted. How many have a test score? But then this year is going to be different. So Rick Clark from Tech, he said, you know what? Roughly about 7 in 10 of his students who were accepted so far or didn't have test scores. I'm sorry, 70% had test scores. That is a typo. I'm sorry. It's 70% have a test score and 80% don't. I'm going to fix that slide. I did it last time as well. Note to self. Okay. Now the Chronicle of Higher Ed did a study of 7 schools, and they found that about half of the students submitted, half didn't. That's a dramatic change. Like Chicago went optional a couple years ago, and they've been getting about 12% of kids who are getting in without test scores. But this is very different. So we think this will be a very different rate. Our friend Jeff Selingo, he's an author. He was a keynote speaker at a recent national conference we went to and spoke at. He was saying these are small data points. These are 5 people he spoke with at one private research university, very, very, very top school. About 70% of kids sent test scores. There was one public, less selective. They take almost half their kids. Only 30% of kids sent test scores. One school, one data point. There was one public university that was not selective at all. They take 80% of their kids. Only about 1/4 of kids sent test scores. Then public research, that's more selective. They take 1 in 4 kids. That was about 7 in 10 kids are submitting. And then there was a private research university, again, one data point, about half the kids. So there's going to be a range. And it seems like the schools that are lower in the pecking order, easier to get into, you're going to have fewer kids having test scores. But when you're really grappling and it's very competitive, and there's a bit of a frenzy of how do I get in when so many kids aren't getting in, more kids are working hard to get test scores in because they realize it's just higher levels of competition. So more competitive schools, higher submission rates. That makes sense. And then here we go. There was one recent university who gave Jeff their data. So they're not as selective, but they said about half, 6 in 10 kids had test scores, but there were differences by major. So out-of-state kids had low test scores. The international was lower because they've been struggling to get testing this year. But what's interesting for me was by major. So the engineering kids, more engineers submitted test scores, then business, and then lowest levels for education, such as work and general ed. And it seems like the engineers, it could be that school, is more competitive. The engineering program, be more selective, and they want to showcase their chops in math, whatever it is. And so it varies by major. It's interesting as well to me. All right, so this year, holistic review, it's going to be changing because, they have to make it work given the new world. Testing has been disrupted. GPA has gotten weird. Many kids, when they were juniors, there was pass fail, and what do you do with that? Many kids can't go and do visits, so you can't demonstrate interest in the same way. You have to do virtual interest, engaging, asking questions, and interacting with your reps and so forth. So they have to reweight and rebalance these things. And there's a big question of, do I submit test scores or not? And a weak test score is not going to help you. So you don't want to send a weak test score. And this actually will factor in for juniors for next year, maybe even beyond. But a strong test score shows strength and should be included. Testing can provide context. Testing can provide, in effect, merit-based aid. And some students, like homeschool kids, may have to find ways to define testing because, again, your parents gave you a 3.9, but in terms of, a test helps put that in context when they have no data from your family, only, and so forth. And so the real question is, do you want the reps to see it? Are they going to add value? That's the real question. We gave a talk earlier at this national conference with Jamie Hansard at Tech. And she was, all about, look at the profile and look at the bottom, the middle quartile. The students, the very bottom, they should probably not send those scores. That was from Jamie. And so unless you really believe it's going to add value, if you're a first generation kid or from a low income place, and there's not many good test scores, and you really stand out. Otherwise, a bottom quartile score probably won't help you at the school. But amazingly, Jamie was saying she was really surprised how many kids were not submitting. There was a very high number of students not submitting scores this year for TT Tech. Carol Lee Conker, she's a friend. She is on admissions over at George Washington, DC. And she said, we don't want to discourage kids if they're proud of their work. And if there's a student from a low income family, first generation kid is below the 50%, but they did really, really well in hard classes, and they're one of the top kids in their, and they can send their 1220 SAT and still get in, but this is a special, a non-purely academic straight kid. This is someone with different context. They become a priority because they're low income, they're first gen. But typically, if you get a very low score, you wouldn't send that to George Washington. And then Sean Felton, he's over at Cornell. Excellent. He's head of admissions over at Cornell. I said, you know what? And I pressed him, I was like, Sean, is there a number below which you shouldn't submit a test score? I said, well, if I were pressed, I would say anything on a section like a 640 on ST, I wouldn't send that. It's not going to help you. And their middle 50 range, half the students who are applying to Cornell are between a 680 and 760 verbal and 720 and 800 math. So a 650 is well below the math range and below that the verbal range. That's definitely going to be a bottom quartile. Rick Clark, our friend over at Tech, said, you know what? If you're in the top half of the class, send it. It's not going to hurt you in any regard. But if you're in the bottom half, if it's something you want us to look at and it shows off who you are as a student, send it. But if you're in the bottom quartile, he's like, I wouldn't send it. It's like, personally, I wouldn't send it. You're not going to help especially with apps being up and its competitive landscape. If you have a low score I wouldn't send it. He said, go with your strengths. And that really is a good message. Go with your strengths. If your testing was not robust, but you have a great GPA, good rigor, go with where you're strong in the great essays and teacher recs and so forth. There could be a dilemma if you have, a really strong, a 740 on math, but a 520 verbal. That could be a dilemma. Do I want them to see that high math score, or am I worried about that verbal being a red flag? And it really depends. It depends upon a number of factors. First, if your total score is in the third quartile, it's important to look at the breakdown. So let's say I have a 1400, I'm applying to a top school, like a Rice. Then if I'm applying to an engineering program at Rice, let's say, and I have a 600 on verbal, 800 math, send it, because the math is the more important score of the two. If I'm applying to a liberal arts humanities, degree, and I have a a much lower, if my verbal is low, I wouldn't send it for that program. So it really depends on what strengths do I want to showcase, and is the weakness in a key area for the submissions office. Never send a real weakness that'll be salient and really important for your success in that field. And also treat every school differently. You may get, let's say, a 28 on the ACT, and you're applying to 10 schools. It may be that for your competitive reach schools, you withhold your 28, but for Texas Tech, that 28's going. So it's like, it shouldn't be my scores, I treat them all the same for every college to which I'm applying. Think about every single school's middle 50 percentile range. And also it depends on your GPA. That if you have average test scores, that can bring down a stellar GPA. If I have a 3.9, I don't want to send a test, which is like top 10% for the college, and I send a test score in the middle or low, that'll actually hurt me. And so if you have scores that are well below your grades, probably don't send them. However, if I have a 3.3, but I have a 1280, 1290, then okay, you actually get a boost from your scores. One thing, our friend Calvin Wise over at Johns Hopkins, he said, you know what? One thing I don't want to see, a weak score, you can't unsee it. And it becomes part of the conversation. So he's had kids who had like a 3.8, good rigor, APs, then a kid submitted a 1 on their AP calculus. And he's like, why? Now I think of you and you get a 1 in calculus. You get a 4 in the class, you get an A in the class, but you sent me the 1. Now, are you ready for the level of rigor that we have at Hopkins? And so he's like, don't send me a weak score. I don't want to see it. It'll actually hurt you. Now it becomes an indelible part of the record and part of the conversation. So only send your strengths. And also, over Sean said, scores matter by major. So again, if I'm looking at an engineering program or something more rigorous, but I'm looking at a fine arts program or performing arts, I'm going to be playing, the cello. My audition matters dramatically more than my test score. In which case, maybe an average score wouldn't matter as much, because if I have a great audition, that's the most salient factor. Here's an example, like Swarthmore. You're applying to Swarthmore. Now their middle 50, which means half of the class is in there, quarters above and quarters below. So for verbal, the middle 50 percentile is 680 to 750. The middle for math is 7 to 790. So their composite score, half of the class is between a 1380 and 1540. The question is, do I send my score to Swarthmore? So if you're in the bottom quartile, you have a 1330. Typically the answer is don't send it. Sean wouldn't send it, Rick Clark wouldn't send it. It's not going to help you because they see scores that are much higher than this. If you have a top half score, the middle number is a 1470 above. If I get a 1480, you betcha. 1490, 100, send those scores, especially this year. This year it's been harder. The real question becomes that third quartile. I have a 1380. And where you are in that quartile matters, because if I have a 1450, I'm going to probably send it. But if I have a 1380, it's like I'm just over the edge. I'm right at the bottom, quarter or third of the normal class. Do I send it? And then it may be, again, do I have a 800 in there, 800 versus a 580? In which case, send the 800 if I'm applying to a quant or a STEM kind of program. And also my GPA. If my GPA is a 3.9, I might not want to send a 1390. But if my GPA is a 3.5 and I have a 1450, I would send it. So these are some of the factors when it balance. Again, it's context. Everything is context. And thinking about, does this represent me well? Does it strengthen my application? And that really is the answer of this. And this is going to be the effect for this year and next year and the year beyond. So this is kind of the new normal, going through this calculus. I think we're entering a world where, this really is, you send if they're stronger and you withhold if they're going to hurt you. Score ranges may shift this year. There's a non-submitter effect that'll wipe out a lot of the bottom students. And typically, Andrew Blasco is a colleague and a friend. He said, you know what, he did research with the University of Georgia. Typically, with 30 schools, when you get rid of testing requirements, your average test scores go up by 25 to 30 points because you wipe out the low-scoring kids. But this year has been tough. There were limitations, hard conditions, kids taking it tired, people coughing, they're worried. They had 2 cancellations there. They feel a little bit frustrated. So average scores may be lower because of COVID effects. So the question is, what'll reign supreme here? The non-submitter effects or the COVID effects, we don't know. So average scores may swing and it may vary by school. And so in terms of us, we are on social media. We do Facebook and Twitter. We update things as we learn them. And right now, we're in the middle of our big holiday savings. Who doesn't love holiday savings? And so we're doing promotion for kids who are signing up. It's our big sale for the year. And kids are buying, you can buy stuff and use it in the spring and the summertime, which is very common. So again, a little plug for us, but it's what we do for a gig. And I think that is the end of my deck. And I hope I answered some of your questions. I bet I did.
That was extraordinary, Jed, to have that amount of excitement and energy and that amount of insight for our parents. There have been a whole host of questions that have come up, but we want to make sure that we give a couple of extra minutes here. If anyone has any questions that they haven't had a chance to flag for Jed to tackle. I know we covered a lot, but I also know that parents and students have experienced so much stress here. So are there any questions that folks haven't been able to share for Jed? Here's one that just came up. Oh, no, that's a thank you. Okay.
Oh,
well, gosh. Again, we're College MatchPoint. We're so grateful that all of you took the time to join us this evening. Lisa and I and our team are lucky to work with all of you and your students. We do have one last question. You noted that students will most likely take the ACT or SAT multiple times. If your student is only registered for both tests just once, do you recommend that they should register for additional tests, even if they do not know which one they will most likely stick with post-practice test?
I want to determine the best lane. So I want to get a baseline score for both tests and then determine which one is stronger or where there is a preference. From that, I'm going to go ahead and start scheduling out my 3 tests officially. So if you're going to take one of each, and you could also just do a practice test. Like, our company does official practice tests. We buy them from the company and administer them. So that could be a way for you to figure out where you're stronger. And you do a free one. You could take the official one, and but then I wouldn't start booking things out until I have established which test is my preferred test.
And Jed mentioned practice tests. In our follow-up note, we'll share with you, Applerouth has been kind enough to set up a practice test system for College MatchPoint clients. So students who are eager to do a practice test, as Jed recommends, and compare the two, we'll be able to help you out with that, and then Applerouth will be able to help you get that information scored. Before we wrap up, Lisa, any last comments to share as parents go back to the evening?
No, I just want to. Oh.
No, you flip it. Yeah.
There we go. Mainly, thank you guys for joining us, and thank you, Jed. And we didn't introduce Ginger, who's also with Applerouth. And we just really, one of the things that Bob and I really love is partnering with the smart people in the industry to bring you guys the best information possible. So we're really excited about that. We have notice people really having trouble with getting practice tests right now. We're a big fan of taking those practice tests and finding your test. And so partnering with Applerouth gives us a good way to do that. But we're really just glad that you guys could get this depth and that you took the time to do this. If you have questions about your specific student after this, I noticed some of you might, feel free to reach out to Bob and I, and we're happy to chat about that, because of course things are individual by student. But I'm just appreciate you guys taking the time, and thank you again, Jed and Ginger.
Pleasure.
Thanks so much. I'll have a great evening. We really appreciate it.
All right. Good night.